reached the halfway point of our week exploring the future of human rights, this morning we welcome Chelsea Follett, Managing Editor of HumanProgress.org, a project of the Cato Institute that seeks to educate the public on global improvements in well-being by providing commentary and free empirical data on long-term developments. HumanProgress.org has been cited by The Washington Post, National Geographic, Human Rights Watch, the World Economic Forum, and the World Bank. Ms. Follett also serves Cato as a policy analyst for the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where she conducts research on human rights and the historic drivers of progress. Currently, she is at work on a book titled Centers of Progress, about how certain places, at certain times in history, have contributed disproportionately toward making the world a better place. Ms. Follett's writing has been published in a variety of publications, including The Wall Street Journal and USA Today, and her work has been cited in numerous books. She also hosts the Human Progress podcast. It is our honor to host Ms. Follett, her husband Andrew, and their son William this week on their first visit to Chautauqua, made possible by Week 3 presenting sponsor Erie Insurance and by the Margaret Miller Newman Lectureship Fund. This morning's lecture is titled Human Progress, Humility, and the Problems That Remain. Please join me in offering our warm Chautauqua welcome to Chelsea Follett.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and to the Chautauqua Institution, truly one of the world's preeminent organizations for the advancement of lifelong learning, for the opportunity to speak here today. It's an honor to even occupy the same stage this week as so many leaders and activists in the fight for human rights, from a Nobel Peace Prize laureate to some of the foremost scholars of ethics at the world's most esteemed universities. The intensity of the collective passion for human rights on display this week is, as trite as it may sound, a reason for hope. And hope is very much needed at this moment in history. Watching the news with headlines reporting despicable human rights abuses, wars, rising authoritarianism, environmental degradation, rampant inflation, 9.1%, I believe, it came out today, a global pandemic still ongoing, school shootings, political assassinations, and more horrors than I can list. It can be tempting to think human civilization is on the verge of collapse, and to feel paralyzed and overwhelmed with anxiety about the state of humanity and the direction we're heading in. It's enough to make anyone feel hopeless about even the possibility of progress with regards to human rights or anything else. In the face of all the various evils and problems afflicting the world today, the temptation to throw in the towel can entice even the most stalwart advocates of human rights. Maybe it has tempted some of you here today, but I'm going to make the case to you that despite all the very real problems that remain, progress is possible. And we know for a fact that it's possible, because the story of humanity up to this point provides evidence of real, measurable progress. Humanity has overcome great challenges before, problems that seemed insurmountable at the time, problems that were so pervasive that in some cases they weren't even recognized as problems because no one thought that change was possible. Progress is real. You just have to look at the data. The website HumanProgress.org, of which I am managing editor, aims to bridge the gap between mistaken, widespread perceptions of hopelessness and the more encouraging reality by making data from reliable third-party sources more widely available. Judging the state of the world by looking at empirical evidence rather than by how grisly the headlines are or the heart-rending immediacy of tragedies conveyed with vivid modern communications technology leads to some surprisingly heartening conclusions. The idea of progress may sound naive or cliched. The notion of progress itself is often held suspect. What's the end point? Utopia? Progress can be uneven. A lot of interesting firsts weren't followed up on or expanded in the ways or as quickly as we might have wished for. Progress is very real, but it has often been episodic or sporadic. And progress is certainly not inevitable. All of the progress that we have achieved does not guarantee continued progress in the future, especially if we fail to properly identify the causes of past progress. Yet it is mind-boggling that the world has improved in all of the ways that it has, and how little attention that fact receives. History is too often told in the academy and through popular means as the story of degeneration, in which we live in the dregs of the ages. Many intellectuals and everyday people alike embrace the declension narrative version of history, a lengthy tale of decay since some lost, idealized, golden age in the past, while dismissing the overwhelming evidence of progress. What do I mean by progress? I subscribe to the definition of progress that HumanProgress.org advisory board member Dr. Steven Pinker of Harvard University offers in his book, Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Dr. Pinker writes, most people agree that life is better than death. Health, health is better than sickness. Sustenance is better than hunger. Wealth is better than poverty. Peace is better than war. Safety is better than danger. Freedom is better than tyranny. Equal rights are better than bigotry and discrimination. Literacy is better than illiteracy. Knowledge is better than ignorance. Intelligence is better than dull-wittedness. Happiness is better than misery. Opportunities to enjoy family, friends, culture, and nature, like we have here at Chautauqua, are better than drudgery and monotony. All these things can be measured. And if they have increased over time, then that is progress. Granted, not everyone would agree on the exact list, but most would agree that it's a necessary start. He wrote, if you're reading this list, you're not dead, starving, destitute, moribund, terrified, hopefully not, enslaved, or illiterate, which means that you're in no position to turn your nose up at those values. Now, he's right that not everyone would agree on that precise list. You might wish to add some components or remove others. And even such currently banal ideas as the goal that we should get as many people as possible to live long, healthy, free, happy lives is quite an unusual view, historically speaking. Most people throughout history did not believe in universal human rights or in the furtherance of humanity. Instead, people tended to focus on improving the lot of their particular tribe or group or family, or even just themselves. And that was if they had the luxury of contemplating the future at all. Often, they were forced to focus all of their energy on their immediate needs and survival, struggling to get by one day at a time. But the ideals I've just described, while new in the grand scheme of human history, are increasingly embraced, reflected in statements such as the UN Millennium Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not all progress constitutes progress in human rights, of course. There is no right to happiness or to a healthy life, not least because there is no way to guarantee those outcomes. But the extent of overlap between the list I've stated and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is nonetheless significant and appropriate. The theme of this week is to explore human rights issues across the globe, including the gains made since the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. So I want to start by bringing your attention to the gains, both since that momentous, if imperfect, declaration, and stretching back farther to the Enlightenment that laid the foundation for the very idea of universal human rights, and have made it so that today, despite the great diversity of beliefs and ideologies that continue to define humanity, the vast majority of people are able to converge upon some shared universal values. While not everyone will agree on what defines human progress or moral progress or what constitutes a human right, and there can be intense debate on these topics, even among similarly minded folks, reasonable people like the attendees of this today. People from a great many different backgrounds can usually agree that the basics I've just described are about as non-controversial a starting point as you can get for understanding progress. But before we get into the weeds of defining human rights and sorting it out from broader progress, by this expansive and hopefully relatively non-controversial definition of progress, has there been any improvement, moral, material, or otherwise? Well, the good news is, while there is certainly more room for further improvement and always will be, evidence from individual scholars, academic institutions, and respected international organizations all show dramatic improvements in human well-being over the long run throughout much of the world. Progress is not only definable, but also measurable. Let's start with material progress, because it plays a critical role in our quality of life today, but also because I will argue it actually undergirds and enables much of the moral progress that humanity has made. Destitution was once the universal norm. Article 25 of the Declaration of Human Rights claims, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." While I and many others remain skeptical of framing that particular goal in terms of rights rather than desirables, the fact that such living standards are today often expected and can be framed even aspirationally as a right, a human right, would strike all of our ancestors, if you go back far enough, as the ravings of a lunatic. Life was a constant struggle for survival, for the bare necessities needed just to get by. Our species, Homo sapiens, is around 300,000 years old. And for the first 290,000 years or so, we were foragers, subsisting in a way that is still observable among only a few groups today, like the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. Even after our species created agriculture and ceased their wanderings, progress was painfully slow. An ancient Sumerian from around 4000 BC would find the rhythms of life and much of the technology available in England at the time of the Norman conquest millennia later to be eerily familiar. Most people survived, if they did survive, on subsistence agriculture, and wealth was mostly reserved for a very tiny elite of warlords and other rulers. Only a very few ordinary people, mostly merchants and moneylenders, ever broke out of subsistence existence and escaped that vicious cycle of ceaseless, unending, back-breaking manual labor, hunger, poverty, and early death. Before the year 1900, more than 90% of people on the planet lived in what is today classified as extreme poverty. And then everything changed. Human economic history resembles a hockey stick with a long straight shaft and an upward-facing blade. For millennia upon millennia, economic growth was negligible, resembling that long straight shaft. And at the end of the 18th century, economic growth, and consequently the standard of living, started to accelerate, first in Great Britain and Western Europe, and then in the rest of the world, resembling that upward-facing blade. After the Industrial Revolution, GDP per capita in several European countries increased as much in 50 years as they had in the previous 1800 years. The number of people living in extreme poverty globally went down from 90% to 10% over the last 75 years. Extreme poverty has halved in just the past 20 years alone. How did hundreds of millions of people rise out of extreme poverty? Truly mind-boggling, unprecedented economic growth is the answer. The majority of all the goods and services made since 1 AD, the notional birth of Christ, were produced after 1900, and around a quarter of all the goods and services made since 1AD were produced in our own young millennium after the year 2000, according to data from The Economist. Scholars disagree on the cause of what has been termed the wealth explosion or the Great Escape. Some think, like Stephen Davies, the wealth takeoff began in Europe because it wasn't united in an empire, and competition between countries encouraged innovation. Others, like HumanProgress.org advisory board member and noted economist Deirdre McCloskey, attribute the transformation to a fundamental shift in how we think about markets and wealth creation, the rise of what she calls bourgeois dignity. Ideas, she believes, are what changed the world. If she's right, then poor countries can adopt ideas and technologies that took rich countries millennia to develop. And indeed, evidence does suggest that the pace of going from poverty to post-industrial prosperity may even be speeding up. What we do know for certain is that the transformation has had profound effects on how we live. Let's move to life expectancy. Article 3 of the Declaration of Human Rights states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. There's good news on the life front. Average life expectancy has grown more than twice as much in the last century as it did in the previous 200,000 years. Around the world, people are living longer. In Teddy Roosevelt's time, he had some nice words to say about Chautauqua, by the way, you should look up. In Teddy Roosevelt's time, in 1900, US life expectancy on average was 50 years. Today, global life expectancy is around 70 years. US life expectancy is around 80 years, and Japanese life expectancy is around 90 years. There are, of course, setbacks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which, just as with the 1918 flu pandemic, caused a hopefully temporary dip in this particular measurement of well-being. But humanity has never been better prepared scientifically and technologically to deal with a pandemic than now. By building on previous market-tested knowledge, we create and benefit from new inventions like mRNA vaccines. And the pace of medical progress is faster than ever. It took about 3,500 years, give or take, between the polio virus's first known emergence and the development of an effective vaccine against the disease in 1948. 3,500 years. In contrast, a vaccine for COVID-19, which first emerged in late 2019, became widely available in 2021, and over 90% of the adult US population is currently vaccinated against the disease. I would say it's a sign of progress that we now, in fact, expect to solve problems like COVID. People lived with illnesses for millennia and never even imagined that they could be vanquished. During the bubonic plague pandemic in the Middle Ages, many assumed that the Black Death was a divine punishment for humanity's sins that should simply be accepted. And some of the brightest minds of the day at the University of Paris, when commissioned by the King of France to explain the plague, concluded that the movements of Saturn were to blame. Others blamed witchcraft. It never occurred to them that through the use of reason, an entire illness or set of illnesses could be defeated forever and relegated to the pages of history, as we did to smallpox, for example. One of the reasons for rising life expectancy would be decreasing death rates for a number of conditions, and not just communicable diseases. Consider cancer. The decline in death rates there is thanks to a change in lifestyles. Smoking rates have declined, but also better medicine. One reason why the decline is even more amazing than it seems is that cancer tends to be more likely with advanced age. It's what kills you when nothing else kills you. And so as life expectancy increases around the world, we would actually expect to see cancer death rates rise, and for a time that is what happens, but we've actually gotten to the point where it is declining. Another reason that life expectancy has risen so dramatically is plummeting rates of infant mortality and child mortality. As a mother, I find that statistic to be the most beautiful trend of recent years. But life expectancy is increasing over the long run for every age group. Next, consider education. Article 26 of the Declaration of Human Rights states, "Everyone has the right to education." Yet the vast majority of our ancestors couldn't even read. More people around the world now receive an education, and literacy rates are at an all-time high. In 1950, the average American attended school for about 9 years. Today, globally, the average person attends school for over 9 years. And then there's moral progress. Some people claim that despite all that has changed in how we live, from modern prosperity to technology, human nature stays the same, and therefore, moral progress is impossible. If the same impulses toward cruelty, prejudice, corruption, and so forth remain with us, then perhaps the claim goes, all that has changed is that we just oppress and harm one another with more advanced tools than in the past. And yet, 200 years ago, slavery was not only widespread, but almost universally accepted as just and natural. Opposition to slavery was once a radical position. Slavery is now illegal in every country. 200 years ago, in every country, women lacked the right to vote or equal protection under the law. Starting with New Zealand in 1893, that began to change. And today, women can vote in national elections in every, even nominally, democratic country, most recently Saudi Arabia in 2015. With the exception of the Vatican, where only cardinals vote. It was considered socially acceptable for a man to strike his wife and to beat his children to discipline them. Go back a bit further, and many people, mostly women, mostly nonconformists, were executed for witchcraft. People in same-sex relationships were once imprisoned or worse. That's still the case in some countries. But today, same-sex marriages, once unthinkable, are recognized by 30 countries, with the most recent being Chile starting in March of this year and Switzerland starting this month. Until 1967, interracial marriages were illegal in parts of the United States. Today, interracial and interethnic marriage rates are at an all-time high. By some estimates, only almost 20% of US newlyweds are in such relationships. People of different religious backgrounds were once routinely and openly harassed and discriminated against. While problems remain, in the United States, has there ever been a better era to be a religious minority, or to be openly non-religious? 200 years ago, people with disabilities were once often locked away in what were essentially prisons, with often appalling conditions. Also in the 19th century, people with unusual bodily differences were put on display and exhibited in so-called freak shows. 200 years ago, public hangings were considered family-friendly entertainment, and people would bring the kids in a picnic lunch and watch the show. One 19th century lynching of 2 black men in Mississippi was described this way by a paper at the time. County officials declared a holiday, erected a double scaffold, and invited all to attend. More than 5,000 men, women, and children responded. The affair took on the aspect of a huge picnic. Lunches were spread on the ground, and soda pop and peanut vendors were kept busy. And when so little consideration was given to human beings, it should perhaps be unsurprising that animals were tortured for fun, including cats and dogs, now considered beloved pets by many of us. The long-term trends in moral progress are undeniable, just as with material progress. Again, that is not to say that moral progress is inevitable, far from it, or steady, because it isn't. But moral progress is just as real. Unfortunately, there is often a wide gap between the reality of human experience, which is characterized by incremental improvements, and public perception, which tends to be focused on unusual, dramatic events rather than long-term trends, leading to discouragement. To rectify widely held misperceptions, HumanProgress.org gathers empirical data from reliable sources that look at worldwide long-term trends in both material and moral progress. The goal is to provide a useful resource for anyone curious about an evidence-based view of the world. I hope that you will consider checking it out. Whereas I and my team think that policies and institutions compatible with freedom and openness are important factors in promoting human well-being, on the website we let the evidence speak for itself. Which brings us to an important question. Where did all of this progress come from? One of the reasons for this transformation is the efforts of individuals, such as in the humanitarian revolution, which took off around the time of the European Enlightenment in the 17th and especially 18th centuries. And as Dr. Pinker put it, to quote him again, it saw the first organized movements to abolish slavery, dueling, judicial torture, superstitious killing, sadistic punishment, and cruelty to animals, together with the first stirrings of systematic pacifism. That movement was spearheaded by bold individuals like Cesare Beccaria, the 18th century Italian writer often considered the first person to advocate for the abolition of capital punishment and the end of cruel, torturous punishments. People like William Wilberforce, the 18th century British statesman who helped to ban the slave trade in 1807 and abolish slavery in the British Empire in 1833, freeing millions of enslaved human beings. People like Mary Estelle and Mary Wollstonecraft, the 17th and 18th century English thinkers widely considered to have been among the earliest pioneers of gender equality, who laid the philosophical foundations for suffrage and women's rights movements all over the world. These heroes of progress were unsatisfied with the way society was and refused to accept the status quo around them. They had the vision to imagine a world that had progressed past norms that were taken for granted from time immemorial and that were common in practically every civilization, but which we now rightly find abhorrent. Norms like torture, slavery, and sexism, once almost universally accepted and now almost universally reviled. The humanitarian revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries expanded in the 19th century with larger scale movements for basic aspects of gender and racial equality, like the right to vote, regardless of sex or race. And the second half of the 20th century famously saw the rise of the rights revolutions, a series of campaigns seeking further dignity and legal and social equality for historically marginalized or disempowered groups such as women, racial and sexual minorities, and people with disabilities. Those movements are ongoing, along with many others, including movements advocating for the rights of children to be spared from corporal punishment, the rights of animals to not undergo mistreatment, and the rights of religious minorities to practice their faith or lack of faith in peace. The list goes on. A recognition of the gains that humanity has made to date is not a request for inaction. The history of denunciations of slavery, torture, piracy, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, and more prove that passionate campaigns can make a difference over the long run. Do not take this presentation as claiming that we have reached the pinnacle of civilization and no further improvement is possible because, well, at least we're doing better than the days of literal human sacrifice. No. Rather, what I'm trying to communicate with a clear-sighted view of the progress that we have achieved is a call to take in and appreciate the dizzying scale of social change that is possible, and to learn from the policies and institutions and individuals in the past that contributed to creating the modern world where, despite the severe problems that remain, people are, on average, over the long run, living longer and becoming healthier, more prosperous, better fed, richer, smarter, the Flynn effect, better educated, safer, and more connected than our ancestors could have imagined. President John F. Kennedy once said, "No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings." Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. He was right. For all the dangers and horrors plaguing the world today, for all the discord and cruelty, there are real, measurable accomplishments that we can take heart from and that impel us to identify and cherish the forces that made them possible. Which brings me to my next point. Why was so much progress in human rights suddenly made after stagnation throughout so much of history? Individual advocacy is most effective when certain conditions are met. That is why certain places at certain times in history have contributed disproportionately toward making the world a better place. The desire to tell the story of those places served as the impetus for the book I'm currently writing, Centers of Progress. From classical Athens to Renaissance Florence, to Hangzhou during China's Song Dynasty, and Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment, some places have served as hothouses of innovation, encouraging both material and moral or social progress. While there are some exceptions, most cities reach their creative peak during periods of relative peace and stability. Most centers of progress also thrive during times of relative social, intellectual, and economic freedom. as well as openness to intercultural exchange and trade. And centers of progress tend to be highly populated. That makes sense because in every city it is ultimately the people, again, the individuals who live there, who drive progress forward. And I would argue that the material and moral forms of progress are intimately related. Material progress, such as abundant food, well-funded sanitation, and general prosperity, has given humanity the security to move beyond basic survival necessities and focus our minds on higher order questions of morality and truth. Essentially, all moral progress can be explained mainly by an increase in empathy and in reason as we have become wealthier, an important background condition that helps cultivate a culture of empathy and reason is prosperity and stability. The richer human beings have become, in many ways, the more humane we have become. The rise of reason and its displacement of the superstitions that reigned over mankind throughout most of history has eliminated many of the traditional motivations behind violence. We no longer believe in a rain deity that demands the blood of children, as many ancient Mesoamericans did, or in witchcraft, as many medieval Europeans did. Yet even today, economic desperation and superstition can combine to lead to scapegoating and slaughter. A recent study found that in the extreme poverty of rural Tanzania, after a poor harvest, women are frequently blamed and murdered for witchcraft. In years where unusual rainfall ruins crops and creates near-famine conditions, there are about twice as many witch killings as in other years. The poorest families are the most likely to murder alleged witches. Village mobs and individual families strangle, burn alive, knife, or beat to death thousands of alleged witches each year, mainly in the most impoverished parts of the world. During the early 17th century, when witch killings were common across Western Europe, Germany's average income was similar to that of Tanzania today. In conditions of extreme poverty, superstitions often thrive. But it's not just the rise of reason that has helped to further human rights. Human history can also be viewed as a continuously expanding circle of empathy, as Peter Singer put it. We began, like most animals, only caring about our immediate families or children, and then the tiny bands we traveled with. But as people began to live in larger groups, we later came to care about a broader clan group, and later about a kingdom, our nation, our transnational religious or cultural group, and eventually the idea that all of humanity was owed some degree of moral consideration, featured in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, came to rise. There is increasingly recognition of the need for empathy for groups whose very humanity was often previously denied, such as racial, religious, and sexual minorities. And yet, the tribalistic tendencies from our hunter-gatherer days are still ingrained to some extent in our psychology. We are all pulled toward bias, favoring our in-group, however we define it, whether it's people who vote for the same political party, or who went to the same college, or who cheer on the same sports team. The good news is that we can mobilize parts of human nature against others, using our capacity for reason and empathy to suppress the tribalistic instincts and other damaging impulses that every one of us is susceptible to. But we must take a clear-eyed view of human nature and avoid the temptation to attempt social engineering based on the lie of the blank slate model of psychology. The idea that the two great totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, communism and fascism, put forward, that people can be perfected, was a lie. The new Soviet man and Mao's blank paper were obvious disasters, and fascism as practiced by the Nazis was also a movement that sought to recraft the world with the pseudoscience of eugenics and populate it with allegedly racially superior supermen. Utopian thinking can lead to some extremely grim outcomes. One of the challenges, then, of human rights is determining where mobilizing the better angels of our nature ends and social engineering begins. There's no single solution because we're talking about optimizing a trade-off, and we certainly should look at the evidence from history and cross-national comparisons. And we certainly know that this is far from the only challenge. Human rights abuses, after all, are often justified by national security concerns, fears of treason, terrorism, corruption, immorality, and many other rubrics that have little to do with human rights. Still, of the human rights abuses that are ongoing, some have been justified, rather ironically, using the language of human rights. If the world is to be effective in defending human rights, we need to think clearly about what human rights are and what they are not. In a world where dictatorships serve on the UN Human Rights Council, and leaders such as former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and current Russian ruler, I hear he prefers that over president, and it fits, Vladimir Putin, have invoked the language of human rights and freedoms to justify all sorts of actions. It can be unclear what human rights are. While there is no doubt a lot of cynicism behind using the rhetoric of human rights to justify authoritarian actions occasionally, there is more going on here than mere cynicism. One of the current members of the UN Human Rights Council, China, stands accused of horrific human rights abuses against religious minorities, such as the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs, human organ harvesting of dissidents, and more. The Russian Federation was suspended from the Human Rights Council in April because, as we all know, it is currently waging a war of aggression against Ukraine. But Russia's record prior to April included killing journalists, unfree elections, and numerous other violations of human rights. The concept of rights has become distorted, diluted. The invasion of Ukraine, for example, was justified by Putin using the language of fighting fascism and Nazis. He would have people believe that he is defending the human rights of victims of fascism. The reality, of course, is that his troops have in fact enacted some of the most horrific human rights abuses against Ukraine's civilian population, with reports of widespread rape, the bombing of a maternity hospital, and more. And yet many Russians believe the propaganda, and the war still receives surprising levels of support within Russia. The forced sterilization of the Uyghur women by China's government that I mentioned as another example was justified using the language of female liberation and environmental protection. Officials claimed to be fighting overpopulation-induced resource scarcity while freeing women from the burdens of traditional roles, but the reality of forced internment camps, compelled abortions, and coerced sterilizations tells a different story. But at least some of the people involved undoubtedly believed the propaganda. So how do idealistic people avoid becoming party to wrongdoing? First, we must hold human dignity and freedom inviolable, sacred, as a line not to be crossed in pursuit of a better world, no matter how noble the end goal. And we must exercise considerable humility in regards to our goals in our pursuit of progress, standing up for our convictions, while always remaining open to new evidence, following the data and recognizing that just as we now look on many long unquestioned practices of the past as abhorrent, in the future it is possible that our descendants will look back at all of us in abject horror and judge some or perhaps many of the common practices of today as nightmarish. Not just the atrocities that we also recognize as wrong, but perhaps even practices that we accept. We should actually hope for that outcome, for our descendants to look back with horror, as it implies a continued expansion of the circle of empathy and the further advancement of moral progress. Perhaps in the future, the circle of empathy will more fully include animals, for example. I eat meat, but I think it is at least possible that maybe meat eating will be looked back on with revulsion. Perhaps not. Perhaps the circle will extend in a direction that is hard for us to predict, but what we do know is that we may be wrong, even about long-standing practices and deeply held convictions, and we must be open to new evidence that contradicts our priors and new ideas. The way to maintain that humility is through openness, not just as a personal disposition, but as a social reality. As the 20th century Austrian-British philosopher Karl Popper put it, only in an open society, in a society which tolerates and respects many views and many opinions, can we hope to learn from our mistakes and so get nearer to the truth. The importance of both robust legal protections for freedom of speech and a culture that welcomes dissent and dialogue cannot be emphasized enough. The free exchange of ideas underlies practically every human achievement and has enabled the advancement of both reason and empathy. But it is a challenging principle, free speech. We know that in the marketplace of ideas, sometimes regrettable ideas win out, from misinformation to mistaken ideologies and deranged conspiracy theories. The temptation to limit speech is constant, such that today in both democracies and authoritarian states around the world, free speech is on the retreat. When he invaded Ukraine, one of Putin's first actions was to further crack down on freedom of speech and limit access to outside news sources in Russia because he feared the power of information. And that brings me to my final point about the causes of progress. In addition to committed individuals, prosperity, reason, and empathy, I believe that institutions and norms of freedom and openness are also key to moral progress and the defense of human rights. And of course, limits on speech need not be as dramatic as legal crackdowns to be concerning. Cultural chilling of open debate can also exert a powerful effect. Today, openness is under threat from the rise of authoritarian populism on the far right, as well as ideological extremists on the far left, both of which seek to shut down debate and to censor and intimidate individuals who stray from their respective orthodoxies. So to not shy away from controversy, let's try to get some clarity on the definition of human rights. Aaron Rhodes, in his book, The Debasement of Human Rights, How Politics Sabotage the Ideal of Freedom, notes that human rights as currently conceived arose from political compromises between post-war progressives and some of the world's worst tyrannies, resulting in confused thinking and a long list of so-called economic and social rights to jobs, housing, periodic holidays with pay and so forth, which today often dominate human rights debates. I've already mentioned that I am somewhat skeptical of classifying those goals, however worthy, as rights. One way to think about rights versus goals is to consider the great philosopher Isaiah Berlin's distinction between what he called freedom from and freedom to, or negative and positive liberty. Negative liberty is freedom from external constraints on one's actions and is relatively straightforward. Positive liberty requires the possession of resources to enact one's will in the context of broader society and is thus much more complicated. Berlin showed that negative and positive liberty are not merely distinct kinds of liberty, but are actually rival and compatible interpretations of an ideal. And unlike the traditional conception of human rights as freedom from, as negative liberty, which requires only that we be left alone, these new economic and social rights, if they are to be understood as rights, are forms of positive liberty and are thus not universalizable. Take healthcare, for example. As my colleague in healthcare policy, Michael Cannon, has pointed out, if healthcare really is a fundamental human right, Americans presumably would have no greater a right to medical care than Indians or Haitians, and if our legislatures really thought that, then they would advocate taxing Americans to provide medical care to people in almost every nation around the world. Now, I'm not making an argument, by the way, about what any given country's healthcare policy should be, but simply questioning whether healthcare provisions should be classified as a universal human right. Our goals include lots of things that we don't think of in terms of human rights. There was a news story recently about a couple in India who sued their adult child for not providing them with grandchildren, which they felt violated their rights. The case was, of course, rejected by India's court system. While everyone agrees that grandchildren are wonderful, and in fact, without grandchildren, the entire human species ceases to exist. Grandchildren are literally of existential importance. There is no human right to grandchildren. Not everything that is good or even of existential importance is a human right. The term human rights must have limits in order to mean anything. The original compromises that elevated the new alleged rights to the status of human rights have enabled totalitarian regimes to sit at the human rights table and, in many ways, poisoned the human rights debate with a toxic hypocrisy. Russia, China, Cuba, Islamist theocracies, and even North Korea can boast about their economic and social programs as supposed evidence of respect for human rights and their own legitimacy. The new alleged rights also distract from protection of the core human rights of personal and economic liberty. Some in the human rights community undervalue that negative liberty, traditionally presupposed by political liberalism. I would argue that openness and freedom in that traditional sense are paramount because the past has shown what free people are able to accomplish. The decimation of poverty, material abundance beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams, technological marvels, and incredible moral progress that we must preserve and expand upon. To sum up, it is my hope that in the struggle for human rights, we all take heart from the reality of material and moral progress to date, that we seek to promote progress while understanding that utopia is forever out of reach, show curiosity about the causes and conditions that have brought about human progress in the past, and continue the important work of valuing empathy, emphasizing reason over superstition, and cultivating an environment of openness to new ideas. Progress is not guaranteed. Our goal must be to understand the conditions that have led to human flourishing and to then use that knowledge to propagate those conditions. to study the past and learn from it. And that is precisely why gatherings like this are so important, and why Chautauqua's mission of lifelong learning is so critical. Because with humility and the freedom to debate, experiment, and exchange, we improve humanity's odds of continued material and moral progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Friends, I know that many of you are moving right on to another program. We ask that you do that quietly. We have just about 10 minutes where we can ask some questions, and many of you have already sent some in. We have those of you that are tweeting questions in. You may also submit questions to our ushers on slips of paper, and you can put in your questions online at questions.chq.org. So, Chelsea, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. And we already have some questions coming in acknowledging all of these points about long-term process, which you've taken us through. And this person asks, can centers of progress exist in an environment in which the 24-hour news cycle and social media discussions dominate?
It is a challenge that we are trying to combat with HumanProgress.org, with the podcasts that we're putting out, with this book that I'm writing. Because, again, one of the big dangers is that we lose sight of the causes of progress in the past and of the long-term trends, of the evidence and of the data. When we are so tied up in the current news cycle, it's very difficult to step back and to have perspective. It is an uphill battle, and while I consider myself to be a rational optimist, it is one of the things that I feel more pessimistic about. I'm worried that people are losing sight of all of that, and that's why we are trying to put forward these initiatives.
Could you leave us all with one tip for how not to become complacent when we look at this and some of us get overwhelmed about how individually we could take action? How do we not become complacent in the light of this?
So some people will tell you to turn off the news, but I actually won't tell you that, because I do think you need to keep up with what's going on if you're going to be actively involved in current issues. But I do think it helps to take a step back and read about some of the heroes of progress in the past. Look into their life stories. We have a series of articles on HumanProgress.org highlighting different individuals whose work has bettered the world. We're actually going to turn that into a book, Heroes of Progress, which will be a companion volume to Centers of Progress, and hopefully publish them around the same time. I'd say read about people in the past who made progress, and also keep up with the positive news of the day and not just the negative news. Look at all of the incredible innovations, social change and progress, but also medical and technological innovations to try to keep your spirits up.
So many Americans now report on the loss of dignity specifically of a middle-class life, including home ownership. And this viewer is wondering, does your data shed light on why this is happening?
Absolutely. So it's true that over the long run, more open trade has allowed many goods and services to come down in price, or at least we've been trending in that direction. The current inflation is obviously not in that direction. There have always been some exceptions. Education, healthcare, and housing are three areas where costs have consistently gone up. Now, a lot has changed over the period of time in which those have gone up, and there has been a lot, I would argue, of overregulation that is partially to blame for that, especially when it comes to housing. NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, you might have heard of it, is very prevalent, and many people weaponize housing regulations to prevent the creation of higher density housing, to actually make that illegal. Legalizing housing, allowing people to have the freedom to build more housing would do wonders for driving down the costs of housing, especially in our most populated urban areas. And it will be interesting to see also how the trend of remote work, which may be one of the most lasting impacts of the pandemic, affects urbanization and housing prices.
So we have some questions that are relating to our past week on the wild. And this person asks if you can discuss wealth creation and rising consumption that are a result of human progress, but also have a negative effect on environment and climate.
Absolutely, right. So whenever we create a new technology to solve one problem, there's always a danger it then creates another, right? And I'm glad that was asked, because obviously the future of the environment is one of the top reasons for pessimism that is prevalent today. And for good reason in many cases. Climate change and the future of the environment present many challenges. But I would argue that even in this area where there are very real problems, there are reasons for rational optimism as well. What we have seen throughout history is that when people live in extreme poverty and they care only about their own survival, they cannot really devote resources or time or consideration to protection of the environment. There's something called the environmental Kuznets curve, where once a country crosses a certain threshold of per capita income, I think it's around $5,000 per person per year, environmental protection starts to increase. With the initial phase of industrialization, pollution obviously rises and environmental degradation occurs. But then after countries pass a certain point, we start to devote more resources and consideration as a society to protecting the environment. And today, while it's true that forest area is declining on average, slowly, globally, in the wealthy areas of the world, in North America, in Europe, and in East Asia, forest area is actually slowly expanding. We are protecting more forests. That's just one example. And also, new technology is increasingly allowing us to do more with less. You mentioned consumerism. Think of all of the different objects that your smartphone replaces. Radio, calendar, television, physical phone. The number of things that you can replace with a smartphone is incredible. Dematerialization is the term for this. And so even as we are able to consume more, technology enables to do that with less. Agricultural innovations are another huge reason for optimism in this area. We are increasingly able to, thanks to technology, increase crop yields such that we can get more food to feed the growing population of the planet with less land, returning more land to nature.
So we started with a question on how to work against perhaps our own individual complacency, and we'll end with a question about how do we work against government or U.S. complacency. And this person relates to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and how we can get the U.S. to sign that. Now, I think this is in relation to the core human rights conventions that the U.S. has been ambivalent about ratifying and moving forward.
Right. Well, as I expressed, I would express some skepticism of classifying some of the goods in that very important but imperfect declaration as human rights. I think we need to distinguish between material progress and moral progress or human rights. Both are incredibly important goals, and they feed off of each other in many ways. Again, as we become wealthier, we free up so many more resources to devote to these higher order questions of morality, and we can make progress in human rights. But it is my belief that if human rights are to mean anything, they must refer to something rather than everything. Now, people can disagree on that. It's just a question of terminology, really. And I understand the temptation to adopt the most expansive definition of human rights possible, because human rights is a term, it packs a punch. And if we want someone to care about an issue, calling it a human right seems like a strategy that some people think they can adopt to draw more attention to an issue. But I would argue that as important and as influential on human rights as some of those material progress-related goals in that declaration are, not all of them actually should be classified as human rights.
Let's thank Chelsea Follett for talking to us about human progress.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.